And the first is, Ayoka and Pumzile, you've spoken about the way in which Inarella and WCCA work together. So I want to ask you, how important is it to have the people who are working in these faith settings with HIV actually being people of faith, living with HIV? Ayoko, maybe you want to start.
I think it's really important because in the communities where we live, people of faith, they are very important and they are the one who are being listened to. So if you have somebody who is a pastor, a priest, a religious leader, speaking to the community, just the example of leading by example, the campaign that the Clinical Advocacy Alliance has been doing. You see religious leaders who have done the HIV test, showing, so the whole congregation will just follow because they know who they are related to and they know what the religious leaders is being doing. So it's really important to have them on board, to work with them, to listen to them, and to do as much as possible to upgrade their information and mainstream the work we are doing together.
Super.
Thank you very much. Theologian Professor John Beatty says that Africans are notoriously religious. So we have religion everywhere, even in our cultures. The faith community was in the forefront of using sacred text to stigmatize people who are living with HIV and also to justify the discrimination against them. Sexuality was also demonized using the very same sacred texts that can also give life. So it's important to have people who come from faith communities, especially trained theologians, who can use the very same sacred texts to liberate people and encourage them to live their lives positively. So I think the challenge of the sacred text is that it can be used in different ways, and we tend to be selective in the way we use it. So when we work with people who are living with the challenges that we are dealing with, they are interested and passionate in finding alternative readings that can make life possible and positive for people living with HIV.
Just hold on to the mic for a moment, Pumzile, and I want to turn the question around slightly. So when we had this Getting to Know Your Status campaign that was being run through the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance, two of the religious leaders who went to get tested and say, this is my example and I'd like you to follow it, was Archbishop Antje Jacqueline of the Church of Sweden and Archbishop Thabo Makgoba of the Anglican Church in Southern Africa. And in the case of Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, you have this additional bridge because the one who tests him publicly is the Health Minister of South Africa, and that's photographed. How important is that in terms of the messaging of getting people to know their status?
It's very important because, as you know, the myth, one of the myths we've had to deal with is that people who are living with HIV, they were infected because they were promiscuous, and also they were very irresponsible in their sexual lives. So when religious leaders lead by example and they get tested, people realize the importance of being tested early enough so that you can manage all the symptoms of HIV. And as we know, now that we have resources, it does not have to advance to AIDS. So it encourages especially men who are reluctant to be tested on time, because it says that I'm created in the image of God. I have the responsibility of taking care of my body, so it's important for me to be tested as early as possible.
So Amy, while you have the mic, when we went into Bukoba and Karagwe and we ran an Our Whole Lives training there, it was very, very clear that both the SAVE toolkit and the Our Whole Lives curriculum are experiential learning pieces. The one focusing very much on HIV and supporting that with knowledge on sexuality, and then Our Whole Lives working on sexuality and giving information about HIV. Tell us a bit about your experience in Tanzania and how those balances and emphases need to be adjusted according to context.
Well, I think that the context is important to be aware whenever anyone is going in to talk about comprehensive sexuality education or life, really, because the skills that we're talking about, whether it's the SAFE toolkit or whether it's Our Whole Lives, really are skills that people need to live healthy lives. But I think that sometimes there's a different entry point in terms of what's at the forefront and how we need to frame what we're doing. So I think that's part of it. And I also just think that I think you were talking about it, Ayoko, about having safe spaces to have conversations and to have people's questions answered. And those are two really, really sacred things, in my opinion. To be able to have a place where we offer information in a non-judgmental context, so we're not taking sacred texts and demonizing people or marginalizing them, and instead we're enfolding people into the kingdom of God. So I think that that's important, to have places that are safe, or at least safer, for people to do that. And then there really is a sacredness in terms of answering questions, because there's so many questions that people have everywhere of all ages. And I don't even think we have to know all the answers, but creating a space where people can ask questions and have trusted adults be willing to engage in conversation with them is really, really important. And I think that transcends the context or bridges whatever context people are in, because those are a couple of things that are important no matter where we are. And certainly there are places where people may say, oh, we don't want sexuality education, but we certainly need to deal with HIV. And, in my opinion, that's really the same thing. We need to talk about sexuality, we need to talk about HIV. It's life-saving, life-changing information, no matter what the context is. But sometimes there are places where having one issue, whether it's menstruation or HIV or toxic masculinity or whatever it is, can provide an entry point to be able to create those safe spaces and answer questions.
Musin, you've been brought into this work in relation to comprehensive sexuality education recently, and maybe you just want to share with us a little bit of what we've been working on together.
Okay. So I think that I came in at the tail end. I still have to go through all the manuals and study that. But I think the piece that I want to add on to what Amy said was the importance of working with CSE amongst different faiths, and I think that's where I come in, is the kind of sensitivities that we deal with when we talk about sex and sexuality within the Muslim community. And so I can, at least as an imam who's been working in that field, bring some of the context, and also as a progressive imam, I often don't like how people, conservative imams, try to soften the blow on certain things, and it looks really hypocritical. So I'm really, to the point, and I think we need that kind of examining of religious texts, and not being apologetic about our faiths, especially when it comes to sexuality and gender issues. So, yeah.
And the Our Whole Lives, as Amy has shared with us already, has this very comprehensive approach to sexuality education, but the religious pieces that we've been working into that are far more complementary than we thought they would be. Do you want to just speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think it's because, and I mentioned this in the previous setting, that you cannot speak about sex and sexuality to a Muslim community from a secular perspective, because even though it makes a lot of sense for them, and you come with all the research and the facts and whatever, they still want to know what is it that the Quran is saying, you know? So I think what I want to contribute to this work is to be able to marry what the Quran is actually saying in a very progressive way of looking at text with the scientific facts around sex and sexuality.
Yesterday, remarkably, in the afternoon, after we had left church, these hands that you see created a biryani that drove all of us quite crazy. It was deep.
We almost didn't turn up today.
It was complex. It was flavors. It was textures. And it was balanced to perfection. So my new quote for Mohsin is, sexuality is like biryani.
Yeah,
well balanced and very deep.
I second that.
So I want to just open the floor now for your questions, and so that we can have a joint discussion around some of these issues. Johanna.
Do you have any examples of working with these issues in the Middle East?
Okay, another question?
Related question. Have you any experience of working with them, for example, in Sweden or similar countries, where the people living with HIV, they also have the stigma of belonging to a minority, and they are completely lacking role models about having a progressive relation about the religion, as you said, and they have it's impossible to have a role model with HIV when you are young. It's like a few hundred people who are young living with HIV here. So no one dares to go public. So it won't be a progressive role model from the community yet.
Okay, thank you. And a third one, and then we get some answers.
I would like to know if you see any changes in the sexual way of being for the young people, because one was your example, and I was thinking that it must be a secret world, even in common people, and it's mostly with the young, because you said the young girls, they enjoy it, they do it, and they pay for doing it. So what is going on? What is changing in the behaviors of the society?
Okay. Mohsin, you want to start?
Well, I think that the other questions are more related around HIV, but I think role modeling is extremely important. That's why I always watch what I do in public.
And the Middle East.
Yeah. But the Middle East, I've been trying to work with people in the MENA region around sexual orientation, gender identity, and Islam. But I think most of the activists that I've engaged with have sort of moved on from Islam. They're not interested in Islam. So they deal with the issue more from a sort of a nationalistic perspective, you know, and the secular perspective. And so I didn't really find a space for my work in the Middle East. It's not only recently when I started to work with organizations like Bidaya, who's a small organization in Egypt, that I noticed that there is a growing need again to engage with progressive Islam. So let's see what happens in the next few years.
Yeah, about young people, I would say that it depends on the context. Like in some places, we have seen a lot of changes from the family side, when there is more open discussion between parents and children, and even we have been able to train some peer young educators for young people to whom they relate to. It's more easy for young people to talk to another young people who is well informed, who can give all the information, or who can even do referrals when needed, or counseling. So we have seen some changes. We are hopeful because, like, I've been working in one school, it's a private school, for the past 6 years. When we started, with the consent of the parents, we did for the one from the first grade an HIV test. And we tried to talk about abortion and all those things. And this year, I had a discussion with the school headmaster, and he has been very, how do you say, positive about the collaboration, because he told me in the previous years, before we started all these conversations, there have been drop of schools because of pregnancies, STIs and all those things. But for the past 6 years, consistently, there was no pregnancy. At least all the young girls, they have finished their course. So we have seen some changes in some places, but the challenges are still there. We need the family, which is the first to help to educate our young people. And then we also have to look at the peer, because we have a lot of peer influence, you know, when they go to school. Like my own daughter, I've come to realize that she likes to go to school early, like 30 minutes before classes started. So I started asking the question, why are you always eager to be there before 7 o'clock when you start at 7:30? Then I come to understand that she likes to go sit with her friends and discuss, and some of the movies I don't see, we discuss and say, oh, it's not useful for you to look at, to watch those movies. So she got all the feedbacks from school. You know, that is why I'm saying we need to look at all these, the family, the friends, and put everything together before we'll be able to see the changes. Thank you.
And I would just add too, I think that's so important, Ayoko, and the idea that education alone isn't the answer, or just information alone isn't the answer, that there has to be conversation, and that we know that just having information isn't necessarily what's transformative. It's being able to have those conversations with not only your peers, but trusted adults, and put the information into context, and also to engage those critical thinking skills for adolescent brains, especially, so that they can make better decisions. I'm gonna let you take the HIV question.
Yeah, with regards to working in the Middle East, we have not started working in the Middle East, and I hope the doors will open, or you will open the doors for us to start working in the Middle East. The issue of sexuality, unfortunately, in faith communities, we are told that if you are a mature, a spiritual person, you should be able to suppress your sexuality. That's the message that most people got. And we are saying that sexuality is just as important as your spirituality. You need to know and be empowered to make the right choices, so that you as a person can be nurtured and grow as God would like you to be. So that's the first message that we say to people, that your sexuality is important. It's as important as your spirituality. So having knowledge and knowing that you can make informed choices when you are exposed to knowledge is important for most people. Countries like Sweden, I think HIV is still seen as a health issue. And it's not just a health issue, it's a social justice issue, rights issue, sexual reproductive health and rights. So somehow we need to peel the layers of the onion and help people to understand that HIV is a virus that can, we are all vulnerable to HIV, all of us. You can get HIV, you know. And once people understand, one, their vulnerability, and two, the fact that sexuality is a gift from God, their attitudes change completely, because then they realize that I actually do not have a right to judge another person who's living with HIV. And I think it's still difficult for people living with HIV to openly share their stories in countries like Sweden, because I think the assumption is I have access to the best health care in the world, and they don't realize there are other aspects that also affect you as a person who's living with HIV.
Thank you. Yeah, carry on, please.
Yeah, and I think also the other thing I want to say is that that then a lot of the work around dismantling stigma and shame belongs to those of us that are in the dominant culture and have the privilege. And so we need to do that work. We need to help dismantle that stigma and shame so that we are creating an environment that is more just and inclusive.
Next round of questions.
I would like to ask Lindsay something. When I worked in a hospital about 20 years ago, I made contacts with a mosque because I was very concerned about there was absolutely no social outreach or anything provided for women who were Muslim who came into our hospital. And I talked to the imam and I tried to encourage them to get a Muslim social worker, you know. I know that in Islam that boys, I believe anyway, are carefully trained in hygiene issues, yeah? And taught about how to keep themselves clean intimately and stuff. Do you have women who also, I mean, I'm quite ignorant really, do you have women imams, you know? Do you have, for example, where you work, do you have anyone who engages in, I imagine it's mostly homosexual men who come to your centre. Do you have lesbian Muslim women who come? And do you have a woman who, you know, can receive them and talk to them about their issues, kind of?
Okay, another question. No more? Okay, please.
Okay. So I think it depends on which mosque you visited. They are very orthodox mosques, mosques that are funded by Salafi Wahhabi funding, so they have to uphold a particular ideology.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Who are they funded by?
The Salafi Wahhabi movement from Saudi Arabia. And so there's a particular ideology of Islam that they need to uphold. And the Salafi Wahhabi ideology doesn't speak very favorable towards women. Yeah, so if you visited those kind of mosques, you would probably see the absence of women, or women is upstairs behind a curtain and so on. But when you, I think in Cape Town, all the mosques in Cape Town women are very much involved in community work. Very recently also some women have actually went to sit on the board of masjid committees. And there's at least another 2 mosques other than our own mosque who also have women and men sitting on the same floor, and women also doing the Friday sermons. On the issue of cleanliness, I think that every madrasa that I have visited speak equally about the importance of cleanliness for both men and women. And there are extensive programs around that, and specifically run by women as well, for women.
What I'm aiming to is that cleanliness for girls and things would also encompass menstruation and that kind of thing.
Right. No, I think there are spaces where women get to speak about these issues. What I've noticed within the feminist circles that I move in is that how they find some of these teachings sometimes problematic when it borders on, for example, in Islam, in Orthodox Islam, they still believe that women cannot fast and pray or enter a mosque when she's menstruating. So some feminists have issue with that. So those kind of discussions I'm seeing more happening. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm not going to have a dialogue on it. Yeah. So I just want to give our panelists an opportunity to make a closing statement. We're here in the Church of Sweden. We do a lot of work around sexual reproductive health and rights. We have been working for many years on the issues of gender justice, and we have looked at how these things are impacted also from a faith perspective. What advice do you want to give us going forward? You start. Okay. and you tell us, why do we need to do more interfaith work?
So I don't know if I can give you advice, but I can tell you where we are at. My work doesn't get funded or doesn't get supported by the Muslim community themselves. I am the enemy of most circles in the Muslim community that I move in. So when I come to places like this that is progressive, I always expect that people would at least support the kind of work that we do. It is not about faith for me as much as it is about it's a human rights issue. It's an issue of human dignity, and irrespective of our traditions and our faith, we have to support one another in that. So I think that's what I would ask you to do, and especially if you have the means to support in that way. The other thing is the importance of working at a multi-faith level. I'll give you one example. When I started out, and what excited me to work on this on an interfaith level was when I first had a presentation, joint presentation done with Good Hope MCC, it's dubbed as the Gay Church in Cape Town, on the issue of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I had to do a presentation, and the pastor was also doing a presentation, and we had not spoken to each other before that, but the conclusions that we reached on that story, it was so empowering for the multi-faith people that were sitting in the room, and that really excited me to see that how faiths can actually come together and look at the commonalities, not the differences, but the commonalities, and how that space and that reality can be used to advance our human rights work.
I'm grateful for the space. JP, thank you for bringing us here, and through the Church of Sweden. The first thing is, I would like the Church of Sweden to continue to help us to read the sacred text. Continue the work you have started, because it is opening doors and it is helping the communities to be who they are, created at the image of God. And secondly, to continue supporting the World Council of Churches in our pilgrimage of justice and peace. Thank you.
I echo my gratitude in being here, and I also want to say that there's just absolutely no way, as a person from the United States at this moment in history, that I would even dream of trying to give any advice to another country. So, bless you all for having me here. I am passionate about this work because it was so personally transformative to me, and because I have witnessed the transformation that it has brought to youth and families and faith communities from my local church in Federal Way, Washington, to Tanzania and beyond. And every time I think it may be small work, God is knocking at the door saying, but what about this? Have you thought about that? And so that's what I would leave with you, is that we all have pieces that we're working on, and we're stronger together. We're stronger together, so if there's anything that that I've offered that could be of service to you, please let me know.
Thank you very much for having us. And Church of Sweden is one of our long-standing and loyal partners, and we really appreciate that. Our programs have changed over the years. We've had to adopt new approaches that we learn as we go, and Church of Sweden is still prepared to support us. There's a lot to be learned from Africa. Maybe that's the first thing I'd like to say. we do a lot of work on a continuous basis. And I think Sweden, because you dealt with some of these issues in the 60s, there is an assumption that you have it all together. But the closer we get, we realize that there are lots of challenges and you can still learn a lot from us. So that's my message. There's a lot to be learned from Africa and a lot to be learned from developing countries. Because in developed countries, issues are reduced to health issues when they are not. Issues like gender equality, Sweden is known all over for its policies, how progressive it is. But I know for a fact that there are still people who experience violence, but we don't have the safe spaces where these people can talk about it. So you can use us. We are not experts, but we love having conversations with you. And let's continue talking about these issues so that people can feel what affects me is also important because I'm special in God's eyes.
We've got another question.
Yeah, when you talk about, when I hear to you, I have another question, and it has to do with the exchange South-South.
Yeah.
I know that the challenge with Latin America is language, because it's not so many people talking English there. But even if sexuality is taboo, it's not as taboo as in other countries. People talk about sexuality quite open, even in the church.
Yeah.
So sometimes in the development world, it's always from north to the south, but it's not so much south-south. It's changing a little bit. But do you have any experiences of learning from each other, from other organizations?
Together with EHIA, we've done a lot of work in Jamaica.
Okay.
And in Arela, when JP was still the executive director, we had a lot of work in Costa Rica, Guatemala, countries like those. And reality is, in Latin America, they've had liberation theology for a long time. So when it comes to theological reflections on some of these issues, Latin America is advanced. It's the reality on the ground that hasn't changed that much. So there has to be a way of bridging the gap between the theological reflections and transformation on the ground.
Would you thank our guests with me? We will break for lunch now, and after lunch, we will give you a dip into the sacred texts. And Mohsin and I will look at some of the texts that we can use around issues like gender equality, sexuality. We might even talk about unani. It won't be a how-to guide, but we will talk. Unani, I'm sorry, you see. Does it make it more pleasurable?
You make it sound like a vegetable.
Now we know the problem. Now we know the problem. So we will meet here again at 1 o'clock to deal with some of those issues, and we hope